I come up with an intro. I've never been good at the intro. All right, hold on.
This is the Bates Museum of Art podcast.
Wow.
You're listening to number 32.
Yeah.
Dang.
There you go. Clara's got it.
Oh, Clara just did it.
Yeah.
So, hello. Welcome
You just
back.
want to switch? You can take your...
No, that's definitely... I'm not doing another one.
No.
So, welcome, everybody. I know it's been a while since a discussion episode has appeared, but we're going to be going back to that format for at least a little while. I actually don't know how many episodes because we are recording this in April. My full-time job ends at the end of May, so I don't know how many of these we're going to be able to get in. So stay tuned for the mystery. That's my plug for the day. To get things back into the flow, we have brought back first the very first guest from the very first episode. Clara's here.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be back.
Very exciting. And then also now this will make it the third time that you've been on here, which will make you the most... how do you phrase this?
The star.
The star.
The star of the show.
You're right. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. Samantha is back as well.
Yes.
So, well, thanks for hopping on here. We're going to be talking about a very exciting new exhibition, which is now officially open at the museum. It's not when we're saying this, but it will be.
In the future.
In the future, where you are right now. And I don't even want to try and say the name because I know I'm going to get it wrong.
I don't
So,
either, but I'm
I'll
do
defer
it.
to you. You have to. Yeah.
Okay. I would say just call it NSK for
NSK,
everybody. It's
yes.
short for New Slovenian Art, and the German is Neue Slowenische Kunst.
Oh, that was pretty good.
Sounded great.
That's what I was going to look up. So I
Yeah.
feel like you nailed it. So, I mean, the number one question then would be like, what is NSK? Which I realize, difficult question. But
Yeah. So it is a collective made up of other collectives, which makes it especially difficult.
This is why I said it was going to be difficult.
There's also some other collectives in the collective sometimes, and there's really no kind of... they're a loose collective, but there's sort of no official membership group at that time. They were all anonymous, so they all kind of worked together, which makes it kind of hard. But the best way to sort of say it is NSK is mainly a collective of three groups. One is the multimedia group, Leibach, which are best known internationally as sort of a European industrial kind of metal band, best way I can say it. And then Erwin, which is sort of the visual artist of the collective. And then the Scipion and the CK Sisters Theater, which also changed names two other times to even more complicated names than that. But they are the theater group. And then they were already existing in 1984 when they all got together to form NSK. And then they created several other small groups within that. And the main one to think about for the show is Novi Collectivism, or New Collectivism, which is the graphic designers of the group.
Okay.
Long story long, that's what they are.
Gotcha. Yeah, and this is a group that's forming out of, I mean, they're Slovenian artists, but they're forming out of the sort of dissolution of Yugoslavia. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's been wonderful to work with Clara this semester. The semester before is when this project really started in earnest and the research side of this. And so I was able to work with the previous intern in the fall, Kira January, who was a historian. And so I sort of gave her this very daunting task of figure out sort of the greatest hits of the history of Yugoslavia, and we're going to turn this into a timeline, because a lot of what NSK is doing is commenting very directly on this specific moment between sort of the death of Tito, and Titoism was its own kind of communism that very much was kind of called the third way, where they were also westernized, but they sort of had a lot of like Eastern European connections, but weren't under sort of the USSR. And so that was a very specific ideology going on in Yugoslavia. And then when he died, there was really no setup for the transfer of power. And so there was about a decade there where, you know, there was a lot of sort of nationalist tendencies with each of these, what are now independent, each of these republics sort of were thinking, you know, this is what makes us different. This is, you know, our group, or our sort of background, specifically not Yugoslavia, and then there was still sort of the communist ideal of sort of we're all in this together kind of group, and then there was the sort of capitalism that was encroaching in at the same time. So this is a really unique decade in the history of sort of Central and Eastern Europe, and so I think they show that, and so we made a really big effort to do something it became a sort of infographic timeline map on the wall before you saw the art that then tells you a little bit about the history of that and the sort of influences from Italy and Germany and really around the world. This isn't it's a remote country, but all countries are not isolated entities. And I think that's what these Slovenian artists are trying to talk about. So.
Gotcha. So playing off that, a lot of totalitarian imagery appears in the actual work of NSK. I think it's like the primary thing that would appear when you're looking at it. Why? What is the purpose of that? Why are those symbols being used? And how are those appearing in the show?
Yeah, I think it's a very specific intention to both the time and the place and the way that the collective works. So when you go in, I really did want you to have this moment to see the timeline, to see all the groups, to really like sort of transition yourself into that place and time, because it isn't like a lot of Western art that we see and a lot of Western art practices. And a lot of people are both going to be introduced to the collective and to the artwork themselves. So having to have sort of an intro moment to understand that like the history of Yugoslavia and Slovenia in particular, there are all these contradicting and challenging power forces going on, especially throughout the 20th century, because you have, Yugoslavia is this nation of sort of republics, and then each of them has sort of been independent at different times. They were under a monarchy. In the early 20th century, they were under the Austria-Hungary Empire.
Right.
And so, that was going on. And then Germany they've actually been a part or either imposed upon or not in German culture since they kind of, I believe the Bavarians came in the like 900s to kind of force Christianization on them. So they've been, so the German influences come from a very long line and a long lineage. And so what they're trying to say is that like Slovenia is not an island. It is not, if you talk about like the national iconography of a place, it actually relates to so many other places. It's not just like, our flag is only our flag and none of the colors relate to anything else and none of the, past relates to anything else and our language is one language. And, so it's, they're trying to say that there are all these forces throughout history that connect them to the neighboring places around them, but also to international avant-garde history. So a lot of what you see that might look a little totalitarianism actually, or totalitarianist actually comes from avant-garde art, Dada, Surrealism, things from the 1930s and 40s. Everything has a connection that goes back, and it's called their method is called the retro method. And of course, they also have 4 different names for it. So it's retro avant-garde, retrograde, however you want to talk about it. But really, it's that they are using all of these symbols and juxtaposing them together, and then it's up to the viewer to kind of make these connections with their work. But there's actually also a lot. I mean, it's really just they're interrogating all power structures, and the main ones that were coming in the 20th century was, you have sort of Nazi Germany, you've got fascism, but you also have communism and capitalism. So they're really it's writ large, talking about power systems and sort of mimicking them to then think about how absurd they are, or like uncovering the absurdities to these power systems. So. Over-identification has been a term that is used, which is kind of like they become more total than totalitarianism, because if you kind of mimic something next to somebody that's being really serious, it shows how absurd that serious person is being. So that's sort of the method that they're doing, and they're doing it seemingly without irony or without any kind of they don't. It's all a performance. They don't really show their hand, and in that way they keep showing how absurd power systems are, because they never show their hand as it being like protest art. But obviously that's sort of part of the underlying issue there. So,
gotcha.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I guess I don't really know if that makes it more clear or more confusing in a way, right? 'Cause it's
I think as someone who didn't know anything about NSK and jumped into this right in the middle, the most important thing is that nothing is what meets the eye when it comes to this group. And I think the best way I can explain it from my understanding is that they're using this, what it seems jarring at first, this totalitarian imagery, is really they're using the imagery of oppressors kind of against them.
Yeah.
And they're reclaiming the imagery that was like once used to oppress their culture.
Right.
Yeah.
So kind of, a sort of positive reappropriation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or just general, like everything is reappropriation for them. Like they also have been compared to some Western art movements, like postmodernism and Dada and Surrealism. I mean, they're taking all of that on too. So it's also, they're looking at Eastern and Western culture. They're putting all of this together and saying like, oh, Slovenia can be part of this art story, can be part of this art canon. But because it's been so influenced by both the East and the West, they're taking from other things. And really, it's, if you're trying to find, it's been really difficult to write some of these labels because you're trying to find where's the original source, and it's just it's like the simulacra or whatever. It's like there's a photo of a photo of a photo.
Everything comes from something.
Everything comes from something. Every single piece comes from something else from there. So
and everything is loaded.
Yeah,
very
sure.
much so. Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of writing labels, I would love to ask you about, as far as the actual exhibition itself, outlining the process a little bit, both from sort of you, Samantha, like putting together the ideas, and then also the role that Clara, that you were playing with it, and how that kind of shaped into something.
Yeah. And Clara, I would definitely hear from you about this too, because I think I kind of started this the semester before, and then having someone come in during the middle, I'd be like, okay, here's this really complicated project.
Here's an art group of art groups.
An art group of art groups that don't want to talk
that
about it.
That have multiple names.
Yeah, exactly. And they're across the world. So, and they're really obscure to American.
Yeah.
But, so, very confusing. But I think too that, and also they have written a whole lot. So they've like written pages on pages, and it's but the whole thing is they're mimicking bureaucracy, so a lot of what they're writing isn't very clear, so it's an inundation of information that is written in this very esoteric way and very vague way, but the point is, they aren't symbolizing anything specific. They're an art group, so even if we talk about politics, they are not talking about a specific, like, a specific politician or political system. They're kind of just interrogating all of it too. So you can't really say what they are for, except this sort of that remaking this sort of artistic imagery and rethinking about Slovenian nationalism. But you can't go in any one direction. So I think the main thing is like, where are all of these references and icons and everything? Where are they from? Because if you were in Central Europe and saw these posters, you could probably tell some of this, unlike the way that we could tell some of this. There's been about 40 years difference, and we might not know what Tito looks like, or we might not know what this speech is from, but people in Central Europe probably would. So my thing was like, I think everything needs a lot of context, and everything needs to be like, this is at least part of where they got this. So we were really breaking down each poster based on these sort of icons they are using and reusing, and like where we can trace that. And then it's kind of up to the viewer to put all these seemingly disparate connections together. So that was like my main thing, is like, we've got to give them context, and we need to break down like sort of these icons, because when I first got this, I had no idea where to go with these kind of things. So for our audience, I think we have to do a lot more work on the text or on the tours or things like that. And then, Clara, where do you come at this? Well,
I think that when I came into the project, you were deep in this research phase, and as I think everyone can tell, it's extremely complex, and there's a lot of material, and
halfway through,
there's a lot of codes and symbols and stories and languages, exactly. So I think something that I was able to help with going into this as someone with fresh eyes and no prior knowledge is just figuring out what are the basics. And our viewers coming into the museum aren't going to be reading, 1,000 pages about the history, the complex
Nor should
political.
they.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No one wants to do that. Yeah.
I think focusing on the imagery and the symbols was extremely important, and just giving something that our viewers can hold on to and kind of guide them through the posters. And
Yeah. No, well, it makes sense. I mean, like, you need to have checks if you're getting deep into a research project to like have somebody come in and be like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about anymore. Like, you've lost me.
Yeah. And I think that was the thing, is like, you're taking all this really complex stuff, and then it was like literally reading like 1,000 pages. And then I had like about 120 pages of my own notes. And then it was like distill until we're about at, ideally 200 words for each work, because you don't want to overwhelm people, because then they won't read it at all.
They'll just stop reading. Yeah.
So this was really important on the exact content we needed to say and the order we needed to say it. And I think, having someone else who was in it with me, who knew all of that but didn't have all that baggage, was really nice to like see, being like, maybe we don't need this, or maybe this goes over here, or just having someone else on that was really nice.
Now, I also want to ask, subtitle for the exhibition, it's, NSK Monumental Spectacular.
Yeah.
What is that? Where does that come from?
Yeah, it came from one of my many pages of notes where I was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, wow, I know, right? I mean, titling is really hard. And one of the things that a crutch that I use quite often is what have other people said? So I'm stealing like NSK, right? So I steal from them too.
They did it first.
They did it, and everyone does it, and that's the whole point. But yeah, so I was reading about them, and so it's like, when they're getting described, or when they describe themselves, what words keep coming out all the time? And so that was sort of like a word bank that I kept. And then like they have a lot of quotes, because they write a lot of manifestos, as you would not be surprised that they write a lot of manifestos. And so Irwin, which is the visual art group within NSK, have this quote that is, Irwin asserts the continuity of the Slovenian past as the only future horizon. Consequently, art represents a ritual of the past and the assertion of death as a dynamic element within life. The ultimate purpose of Irwin's activities is to reassert Slovenian culture in a monumental and spectacular way. Did I understand all of that? Not really.
Yeah, but, first pass. I don't know if
that's like a few sentences of how they write, But they one of the books that I read kept calling their work, or describing the work of NSK, as like monumental or spectacular. Okay. And then I was like, well, they're saying it's monumental and spectacular too. And I was thinking, well, the poster itself is supposed to kind of grab people's attention. And this is, at its core, it's 11 posters from the 1980s. They are screen prints, so they are, collector's items, but they were used to be sort of album covers, or posters for tours, or posters for theater productions, so things like that. And so a poster is meant to grab you anyway. And so there is like this spectacular element. It's a bit of a propaganda idea. And like NSK had this sort of total work of art sort of idea that everything was part of their art performance. And so posters were very much elevated to that kind of fine art view in that way. And then also just they like to think about monuments, as far as when we think about a monument as like what it means in national culture, like what it can mean as like a power symbol, and then questioning that. And then the spectacular, they like to both have fear and fascination in what they do, and it goes back and forth. And so I think it was kind of fun to use those two words that constantly describes them, and one of the group describe them like that too. So
total work, is that like the what's the German that's like a Stumpfwerk or something? I'm sure I just butchered that.
I was actually going to put that in my notes and make sure that I said it right, but I didn't do that. I was too worried about NSK.
I used that in my senior thesis. Do I remember how to say it?
Yeah, I can spell it probably.
Yeah.
But yes, they very much come from that background that came out of sort of 19th century like German kind of art, where it was this idea of a total work of art. So anything that you do is part of the pieces are part of the whole, and it's sort of this idea of this kind of artistic life. And a lot of what they're doing is even like mimicking the state by making passports or things like this is all part of it's all part of art. It's all part of their art process. Or like dressing in like all the 5 members of Irwin would all dress in suits. So it was like this performance of like weird, like normcore, in a way. So they just wear these like regular suits, and then then Leibach would dress in, they would dress in these, they looked like sort of Tito, like Yugoslavia military uniforms. So, it was all performance in a lot of ways. And that was kind of fun, but confusing.
Yeah, right. So even though they're in these like sort of subdivided groups, the groups are all still tied together.
I think at the time specifically.
Banner. Yes. Yeah. Maybe not so much in later times, but.
Yeah. So you'd have, like, for instance, if you have the theater group, they would put on this big performance, and then Leibach, as sort of the musicians, would do the score, would compose the score, and then Irwin would put on a show related to it. So it was all around. Right. They they have their own terminology for everything. So the dictate of the motif is sort of what it's around. So it's like, okay, we're going to talk about the stag, or we're going to talk about there's nationalist symbols that then they all do work around or related to, or this idea about the avant-garde and sort of translating it for Slovenia. So they all work around these larger ideas or these specific symbols that are really charged, and that's how they kind of make all their work together.
Gotcha. So yeah, sort of the final question. It's not really a simple question, really, because the rest of it has been so obvious. Like why would someone care about NSK? Like why have this show now? Yeah. What is there? Maybe either one of you, if there's a specific connection that you think would draw somebody into that work.
Yeah, Clara, I might have you tackle this first if you're thinking, from your perspective as a student, but also, coming out of sort of art history, and you just spent a while in Europe. So yeah, like how have you found relevance or meaning into their work?
Well, I think I'm really interested in just the way that people use art as a means of rebellion. And I think, as I talked about before, I was particularly interested in just the reclaim and reuse of symbols and how symbolism can be malleable and it can change. And that was something that NSK taught me. And I think NSK matters because it's a very influential and monumental and spectacular and art collective that I didn't know about. And Sam, I don't think you knew about it before. And as someone who studies art every day and has had for the past 3 years and consumed by it, this is something I never knew about. And it's so complex and so rich, and it's so multifaceted with music and the visual arts and performance art. And it was really interesting to see how this collective of people with different interests and different mediums can use their art and harness it in order to create or help create an identity of a country that has experienced so much political turmoil.
Yeah.
Oh, you said that really nicely.
That was compelling.
I know. Good job. Yeah. I was like, I don't even know if I need to add that much. But yeah, I think for me, too, I come, like, my undergrad years and years ago was in culture anthropology. So part of how I sort of take on learning about art that I'm not familiar with is become really immersed in it and, like, just, like, what is going on in this time, in this place that is really fascinating. And I think it's just another method and process of how artists can deal with or interrogate or question the times that they are living in, and also sort of systems that of inequality, but also maybe internalize their own internalized compliance, like, in sort of our own systems, how we all sort of self-censor ourselves. So I think it's just such a unique project because it isn't a simple, this is a protest piece or this piece is for the state or isn't for the state. It's all of the in between that is it makes it really hard, but makes it also incredibly fascinating. So you just want to kind of dive deeper. And I think there's a lot of meaning today and relevance today with different ways that artists and artist collectives can can interrogate what's going on and interrogate power systems. And, this is just such a unique example of doing that. And it's a great way to both introduce the collective, introduce the work that's in our collection, but also sort of give people this slice in time that may connect with them more than they think.
Yeah. And I'll just add that with my brief exposure to NSK, and they've been talking about how the appropriation of symbols again, like that to me is such a compelling idea, because there's been a lot of different reactions in Europe and the U.S. sort of after some of these totalitarian movements. Not that there aren't any in the present, but you look at in Germany, the symbols of Nazism banned entirely, and that's been one approach in some parts of the world. And I kind of love the idea of with NSK about making these things absurd. I think that actually sort of has a little bit more staying power in a way that's kind of funny to me.
Yeah, it is. It is like if you make fun of power, like they don't know where to put you in that way. Like they know kind of, okay, here's a protest and here's how we can turn that around. But if you're like mimicking them, it really looks worse on them in a lot of ways, which is a really interesting and funny thing. And I think when you do get that shock of like, oh, these things look like they're for these kind of systems, but actually when you break down, which we have all the symbols, a lot of what they're using are actively anti-fascist artists who came out in Germany against these kind of movements. Like a lot of it is very directly interrogating. Even if you go back further into the symbols they're using, it's supposed to kind of initially shock you, and then you are fascinated with it, and you go in a little deeper and kind of come up with these ideas of like, why does the face of the Statue of Liberty why is it on this drummer that relates to the Joy Division album that also relates to Hitler Youth? How does this work together? And that's up to you, dear viewer, to decide.
Well, you'll just have to come and see for yourself.
I won't give you those answers, but you'll get a really good context for what
Yes, right, exactly. So great. Well, the show's going to be up from basically now, whenever this is out, all the way through mid-October, I believe.
October 5th.
October 5th. Wow, we have a date.
Yes.
Isn't that exciting? But yeah, thank you both very much for coming and talking to me about this.
Thanks,
Peter.
Peter.
Thank you for having us.
I've learned a lot, and I hope you have too.
I'm trying.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.